Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I can see there's something like 56, 57 people. Thank you, everybody, for joining. My name is Mark Harrison. I'm Head of UK Applied Science at the Met Office, and it's my privilege to welcome you to this briefing regarding the CCRA4 technical report. As the name suggests, this is the fourth iteration of an independent assessment of the risks and opportunities that climate change presents to the UK. If anyone has any technical issues with Teams, please pop a comment in the chat and we'll get back to you to try to fix that. Next slide, please, Rob. Okay, before we start, I should say that this session is being recorded and will be uploaded for other people who are not able to join us today to watch back at slower time. This is broadly a rerun of the original kickoff meeting back in July. We were made aware at last minute that there was a clash with a local holiday. I think it was in Northern Ireland. Hence, we're encouraged to rerun the session. So we'll be covering broadly similar ground, but we'll be adding a couple of slides to cover progress to date. So over the next hour or so, we hope to share some details regarding our plans, then answer some questions that you might have. We're allowing a fair amount of time for this, so please start posting your questions in the Q&A function. I'm joined by 4 other speakers, so if I could ask Flo, Jason, Rachel and David to unmute, put your camera on, and introduce yourselves in turn, starting with Flo.
Thanks so much. The turn order was again. So my name is Flo Bates. I head up the 4th Climate Change Risk Assessment at the Climate Change Committee.
Hi there, my name is Jason Lowe from the Met Office, where I'm Head of Climate Services for Government, and I'm leading the consortium with Mark Harrison that will deliver the technical report to the Adaptation Committee. And over to Rachel.
Thanks, Jason. Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Perks here. I am a science manager leading the climate resilience team at the Met Office and supporting a number of different aspects on the CCRA4, but representing engagement here today. Over to David.
Hi everyone, I'm David Dawson and I am a co-lead on the methods chapter, helping all the other chapter authors develop the methodology to deliver the final outputs.
Thanks everyone. So in terms of agenda, in just a minute I'll be handing over to Flo, who'll be setting the scene for the technical report and putting this in the context of other work that is ongoing. Then Flo will hand over to Jason, who can talk through our approach to the delivery of the work. Then I'll share a few more details regarding the consortium itself. Rachel will explain the ways in which you can get involved, and then David will conclude by giving a bit of a progress update on some of the work done to date. Finally, we'll have a question and answer session, so if there are any questions that are asked that we don't get around to today, we'll publish these together with some answers online. We also have Katie Peat from DEFRA who's joining us for the Q&A, so thank you, Katie. So without any further delay, I'll hand over to Flo.
Thank you, Mark. If we can move to our first slide. So yeah, as Mark kind of set out, I'm going to kind of give a bit of an introduction to what the 4th Climate Change Risk Assessment is and where the technical report sits within that. So the Climate Change Act of 2008 established a process whereby the UK government lays before Parliament a climate change risk assessment once every 5 years, with the next one due in 2027. The Climate Change Act also set out that this should form the basis of the national adaptation plans, where we have one for both the UK, but then also all of the devolved administrations in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, with the next one, UK one, due in 2028. The Climate Change Committee's role in the CCRA process is twofold. So first of all, we've been commissioned by the UK government and the devolved administrations to produce an independent assessment of UK climate risk, which we're coordinating, but is being delivered by a range of organisations, including the Met Office Consortium on this call. We'll also be providing our statutory advice, and this is where we sort of set out our policy recommendations of the changes that as the committee we would like to see. On top of this process of feeding into the climate change risk assessment, the Climate Change Committee has another important role through our regular progress reporting, with our next progress report on the implementation of the third National Adaptation Plan due in March 2025. If we can move to the next slide, please. So this is, as Mark said, this is the fourth climate change risk assessment. And in our independent assessment, which we're delivering on behalf of the UK government and devolved administrations, there are kind of four key objectives that I wanted to highlight. And this was sort of launched in May this year, and you can find more on our website. But our first objective is that we really would like the fourth climate change risk assessment to build on previous assessments. We want that kind of backwards looking continuity and making sure that we have learned the lessons of previous climate change risk assessments. Secondly, we want our climate change risk assessment to be authoritative, evidence-based and up to date, so providing the best evidence possible to government. Thirdly, moving beyond what we achieved in the third climate change risk assessment, we are very keen that this risk assessment supports adaptation action, in particular that it builds the case for near-term adaptation action, both within and beyond government. And finally, we're really keen that the communication of the risk assessment is useful to and usable by key decision makers, both within and beyond government. If we can move to the next slide. So there are three key outputs across which we would like to deliver these objectives. So the two on the left represent the independent assessment, which we're focusing on today. So first of all, we have our technical report, which the consortium at the Met Office is delivering. And through the technical report, the authors are reviewing the evidence that's been published, so both the peer-reviewed evidence and the grey literature, in order to identify the climate risks and opportunities that the UK faces from physical climate change, and also assesses the urgency of taking additional action for each risk. In addition, and this is a new output for CCRA4, we're going to be producing the Well-Adapted UK report. Through this report, we want to set out what does good adaptation look like across the systems in the UK. We want to assess what the costs and benefits are, and we want to set out objectives for both the short and the longer term. And we're producing a kind of series of innovative analyses in order to draft that report. And then finally, outside of our independent assessment, we also provide our statutory advice to government. So as I mentioned before, this is sort of setting out the recommendations around policy actions that we'd like to see in the next set of national adaptation plans. And even beyond that, we'd like to highlight near-term opportunities for strengthening adaptation policy. If we can move on to the next slide. So before I hand over to Jason, I just wanted to set out what the Climate Change Committee sees as the objectives for the technical report component of the UK Climate Change Risk Assessment. So as I mentioned before, the technical report is really a synthesis of the most up-to-date evidence around the range of risks and opportunities that the UK faces. We see that the CCRA4 technical report will really be an update of the CCRA3 technical report. So you want to ensure that backwards looking continuity and to really focus on where the evidence base has changed. Secondly, some feedback that we got from stakeholders around how the technical report from CCRA3 was used was that it was challenging to understand what the priorities were, both at that UK level and for the different nations within the UK. So we're looking to refine the urgency scoring framework and make it clearer which rich risks are the most urgent priorities to address. And then finally, we're really keen to co-develop an accessible report which decision makers find easy to use and to navigate. So yeah, with that, I'll hand over to Jason, who'll talk through in more detail what the technical report is for CCRA4.
Thanks, Flo. Next slide, please. So I want to begin by just reflecting back on that exam question and what we're trying to solve as a consortium. So what we're really trying to ask is, how has the evidence on the full range of risks that face the UK and their urgency continued to evolve over the last 5 years? And in doing so, firstly, we very much reflect that view that here we're looking at the change. We want to build on CCRA3 and the excellent assessment that went into that report. But we also know that the science has been moving very rapidly over the past few years. That's not only the underpinning climate science, it's also the science of how people are experiencing risk and responding to climate change. So we'll work with stakeholders to agree a more manageable list of relevant risks. And that's important if the information in the report is going to be used to understand risk, but also help to plan adaptation. And we'll also work closely, and we're already doing this, with the adaptation committee to agree around the idea of an extra urgency category and what the pros and cons of that are and how we'll implement it. Next slide, please. There are several principles that our bid is constructed on top of. So the first one is this idea of focusing on what's changed and what's most urgent. The second one is this idea of co-development with stakeholders. And we recognize that there are different types of stakeholders. And those stakeholders, they're able to put in different amounts of time to engage in co-development. So we're not going for a one-size-fits-all. We're adjusting the co-development approach to the time that the stakeholders can contribute to the project, and also the time that we need to produce a good and authoritative report. This is such an important project that we thought a lot about resilience within the consortium. And what we're doing is we're making sure that we have joint leads on all the sector chapters. We're also trying to draw on existing structures. So we're using, for instance, the Met Office Academic Partnership and also other existing relationships, such as those around infrastructure operators. We want to have a diversity of ideas. Now, we will get that within the consortium by having a mix of people who've worked on previous CCRAs, but with people who haven't done it before and bring a new perspective. And we also want to make sure we bring in ideas from early career researchers and bring in the ideas from this range of stakeholders. And together, we hope that will lead to the idea of a much broader set of ideas going into the analysis. We also take quality very seriously. We have a science assurance panel, which I chair, and we're in the process of building an external independent panel. Community review will also be really important, and you'll see when I show you the timeline where it's possible to input into that community review. Next slide, please. One of the inputs comes from looking at how people have used CCRA3 technical report. And so we had an excellent piece of research that was carried out by and led by the University of Leeds, Susie Lorenz. It was a mix of desk-based research, looking at publications that use CCRA3, and also engagement, going out and interviewing people or running focus groups. And some of the key points that came out of this are now informing how we're constructing the technical report for CCRA4. Some of the points we got back, there was a mixed view on the number of risks, but I thought one of the really interesting aspects was the observations that some of the risks, they feel like buckets. They're really broad. They actually consist of many component risks. Others are the size of a thimble and are extremely specific. And as you look through the 61 risks in CCRA3, I'm sure you can pick out lots of examples that fall into each of those two categories. It'd be nice to have a bit more balance, is one thing we're hearing. We're also hearing that we should be taking more account of the interdependencies and challenges of ownership of interdependent risks. And I think this plays into the idea of a bigger understanding from a system point of view, a system dynamics point of view. There's also a desire to understand in more depth the idea of surprises and shocks to the system. These might come from externally forced shocks, or they might be a characteristic of an interdependent system. There's some interest in also better understanding and maybe graphically mapping the chain that goes from hazard through risk, through impact, and to risk owners. There's also a call for a stronger economic analysis of impacts. Now, these lessons, we can pick some of them up in the technical report. Others might be best picked up, for instance, in the State of the UK report and thinking what a well-adapted UK looks like. Next slide, please. One particular aspect is the approach to risks, and I've mentioned the 61 already. You'll also be aware that 34 of those were put into the top category of more action needed. You can see them on this diagram on the right. I don't expect you to be able to read all of those. It's to illustrate the number falling into each category. And if you're marking everything as most urgent, it makes it incredibly difficult to prioritize action. So what we've been thinking about is, firstly, can we come up with a better definition of the risks that is more recognizable by the risk owners and is balanced in terms of the size? And so we've been working throughout the summer towards a refined set of descriptors, and we're coming down from 61 risks to a smaller number in the 40s. We're also going through the process of recognizing that if we are going to separate out the categories and be able to have some more granularity, then we're going to need to modify the magnitude scoring and the urgency scoring. And probably the way to do this that maintains the best backward compatibility is by adding an extra magnitude score and an extra risk score at the top end. We've been learning what others are doing. In the European risk assessment and also a risk assessment in New Zealand, there are some particularly valuable examples of how they've tried to address these same challenges that we're looking at in CCRA4. So we've been learning from those. Next slide, please. Another change is in terms of how we think of the climate scenarios. And there's a very helpful document that the Secretariat at the Committee on Climate Change have put together, talking about the framing of climate. We're summarising it here. And the way to maybe think about this is, if we view the future emissions that are compatible with current emission pledges and policies, there's actually quite a wide range. But if we follow that forward in time, it means we can put more emphasis on understanding what's happening at the 2030s and the 2050s. And we can also look at the central response, because the response is uncertain, but we can also focus on the high climate hazard end of that distribution as well. So it's moving from the simple 2-4 degree framing to a more nuanced framing that lets us look at different points in time while still retaining the advantage of the simplicity and the ability to communicate the global warming level information that was pioneered in CCRA3. In the climate chapters, we'll also be thinking beyond the 2050s and trying to understand also surprises in the system associated with high impact, lower likelihood scenarios. And my final slide, please. In terms of a timeline, so we started back in the spring. So some of the tasks we've now completed. We began by thinking about the protocols of co-development, how we were going to work with stakeholders, how we work with the adaptation committee and the Secretariat. We've also carried out this review that I've shown you some of the results from to learn how the past technical report was used. We've taken that into account. And an area we've spent a lot of time really focusing on and trying to balance the pros and cons of different approaches is refining the method. We'll hear a little bit more from David later, who's one of the people who's led on that area. And now we're into task 5. So this is each individual chapter that consists of a range of 2 lead authors, an author who was involved in the PASS report, and a set of contributing authors are carrying out an initial review of the risks and thinking about where the new evidence is and what are the big changes since CCRA3. This stage will last for a few months more. Then we will go into a deeper dive, and then later in the process put out an interim version of the assessment for community review. Something that's very important is getting your views, and one route for doing that is via an open call for evidence. That's still open, and our first call runs to the 30th of September. So if you've not responded to that so far, do please try to put in the evidence that you've accumulated in your organisation, because it's absolutely invaluable to the chapters and the writing of this report. And that might be lived experience, it might be reports that you have constructed and had peer reviewed internally, it might be pointers towards articles in the peer reviewed literature. All of that is useful. So that's our approach. I'm now going to hand back to Mark to talk more about the consortium, and Rachel to talk about how to get involved further.
Thank you, Jason. Okay, so in order to deliver this work, it's clear that we required input from people with a wide range of skills and expertise. So we started off by reaching out to our academic partner universities before then bringing in additional skills and expertise from the National Climate Science Partnership. Since then, we've been approached by a range of other organisations wanting to get involved. So we've welcomed them, and they're helping contribute to this work. It's really great to have representation from across the public, private, as well as the third sector. The ... at the bottom of right of this slide is in recognition of the fact that if you'd like to get involved yourself, then please reach out either by contacting one of the lead authors directly or via the generic email address on the screen. So in terms of the way in which this report will be structured, we have 5 main chapters: economy, health and well-being, built environment, infrastructure, and land, nature and food. We have lead authors who are accountable for the delivery of their respective chapters and act as primary points of contact for their chapter. The primary purpose of having joint authorships is to build in a degree of resilience. Continuity between the iterations of the CCRAs is clearly very important. So the lead authors are supported by what we have termed continuity authors. As the name suggests, these are people who have been involved with previous iterations of the CCRA process. We've also introduced this concept of fresh eyes, where the fresh eyes cohort are early career researchers who have been asked to challenge our thinking as we develop this work. The intention is that the fresh eyes cohort will also benefit from this experience and will be well placed to take on leadership roles in future years. We then have the methods team, which is coordinating our approach and ensuring consistency across chapters, as well as the science assurance team that Jason spoke about earlier to ensure the quality of the work and the outputs. One that sits as part of the consortium, and then the independent review group. Finally, we have the rest of the team, which includes myself, the knowledge integration and comms team, who are creating the plan for engagement, as well as the small team that's been looking at the way in which CCRA3 was used to inform our plans. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Rachel now, who will elaborate on ways in which you can get involved.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Mark. So I'd just like to come back to the slide that Jason presented earlier on the tasks that we're working on to deliver CCRA4, as this links to some of the engagement opportunities for everybody on the call today. So as Jason mentioned, we're currently working towards task 5, the initial review of our risks and opportunities and collating that new evidence, and then soon to be going into the deeper dives on specific topic areas, and then pulling that all together before inviting you to support an assessment and an interim review of the work that we've done together. So I'd just like to go into each of these areas in a little bit more detail to explain how these tasks link for your evidence that you can provide us. So as Jason's already mentioned, we have the open call for evidence that's open now, and I've just popped a link into the chat so that everybody can access the webpage where that lands. This does close at the end of the month, so I encourage you to get your skates on and contribute soon as opposed to later. The call for evidence can be a mixture of academic papers or project reports that you might have written for government, and various other bits of grey literature, including conference proceedings or webinars, etc. In due course, we will also have a further 2 calls for evidence, but this will be very much targeting research gaps, the things that we've not received the first time around. That, please. And then going beyond the open call for evidence, there are a couple additional engagement opportunities that I wanted to highlight today. So back in May, the chapter lead started engaging with various different technical and academic stakeholders, and we're following up on those conversations that we've been having to date by doing some essentially chapter-led technical surveys with key groups. So if you feel like you'd want to contribute to a specific area of CCRA4, I highly advise you to reach out to the generic email that's on the screen there, and then we can coordinate which chapter your skills and expertise best suit and how you can feed into that surveys going forwards. So in October, November, so in the autumn, we're looking at running a couple of different sector-specific workshops or chapter leads attending specific events that already exist that we can streamline our engagements. An example of that is the infrastructure groups that Jason mentioned at the beginning of the slides today. And then going forwards into next spring and early summer, we'll have essentially pulled together a large proportion of the engagement and the results dates. So we'd be looking to run a stakeholder event to go through the key methods and the key processes that we've run through and present some of the reporting that we've got to ahead of essentially inviting you to feed back onto that report come summer 2025. So next slide, please. And now I'd just like to hand over to David, who's going to talk through some of the key methods that we've been working on.
Hi, everyone. So, yeah, just sort of a recap on CCRA4's method. Perhaps for those of you who maybe haven't been involved in CCRA before, those of you who have, this is no surprises here. So basically, it takes, as Jason said, this sort of exam question-based approach where the chapter authors go through a series of questions and gathering evidence from various locations that have been announced already, and academic literature, and then go through a process by which to make judgment on that evidence. And it's the methods team, myself and David Jaroweski at Birmingham University's job to sort of orchestrate and guide the chapter authors through that process. So we've basically been very consistent with CCRA3. And following a very similar process. Early on, it was judged that what the phrase evolution, not revolution, was the best way forward. And so we are making small changes to the methodology in line with what we have learned from documents that DEFRA have put together and the communications that we've had with stakeholders, as Jason announced. And one of those is an extra urgency score. So a very high urgency, and also urgent investigation needed. So where we might have risks that we don't have that much evidence on, but we feel that we urgently need more evidence to help understand those risks. So the chapter authors at the moment are going through this process. So they're starting with these high-level questions about what's changed since CCRA3, and that's both in terms of risks and adaptation, and also opportunities as well. And they work their way through subsets, and they do this for each individual country. And then we will move into task 6 later, or towards the end of the year and the early next year, by which we will start to put those risks into different categories. Rob, if you could just move on. So a bit more detail about what's been happening. Prior to this meeting, we were working on what was known as Task 3, which was looking at the risk descriptors themselves. So we re-reviewed CCRA risks and opportunities, and through a process of review and feedback, rewrote some of the risk descriptors. And that is more or less complete now. And we also started to develop the methodology for CCRA4. The authors are now going through collating evidence on changes since CCRA3, which was part of Task 5, and going through that lit review process. They are not yet at the process of developing scores, but they are moving on that way. And as the methods team, we're offering various support along the way, including video sort of summaries of guidance, method surgeries, and chapter meetings to help support them as best we can. Following the submission of Task 5's outputs, which is due, I believe, in December time, we will move into the full urgency scoring, which at present myself and David are putting together the documentation on that urgency scoring approach. We haven't fully locked that down yet, so if there are things, I'm seeing things in the chat already about how we're going to go about that and things that you think we should consider. Now really is the time to raise your hands and put some suggestions forward, so that we can incorporate that. So in the full urgency scoring, that will be how we help divide the risks into very urgent or very high and high, etc., medium and low, to try and get those subset of very high risks. But there will also be other elements within the chapters that won't be in the scoring, but will be written in the chapters around systemic risks, interdependencies, and the like. So as I've said, it's evolution, not revolution. Everything that was in CCRA3 will be incorporated into CCRA4, but with some advancement, as Jason acknowledged. So if you just move on to my final slide, Rob. So to date, the sort of outcomes here, I don't expect you to read those. Again, that's just for illustrations, but we currently have 45 risks in CCRA4. Now, as I've said, every risk in CCRA3 is incorporated into CCRA4, but some of them will be embedded within another risk now, but they will be fully accounted for in the urgency and magnitude scoring that we do. So please don't worry if you feel there's something missing there. Some risks have been split. We've split the health and the built environment sector up explicitly, and we've had quite a few meetings on how to do that and how to do that effectively. And so, yeah, we're at that stage now where the chapter authors are taking each one of these risks and gathering the evidence for them. As I mentioned, we're providing all the guidance we need for them over the next few months to support them through that process, while we ourselves are developing the next stage of the methodology, which will go through the process of quality assurance and independent review, and also we present regularly to the adaptation committee for feedback and guidance, and we're always open to discuss. So that's all I have to say, and I look forward to speaking to you soon.
Thank you, David. Next slide, please. Which is questions, it should say, and answers as well, because that's the aspiration. So this is an audience participation moment. So I can see there are just a couple of questions in the Q&A that have already been posed. If you do have any questions, please note them there, and we'll do our best to answer in the next 20 minutes or so. So the first question is from Jude. I think this is probably best answered by you, Flo. Thank you for putting your camera on. So when will the well-adapted UK report be published, and what is the timeline for its development?
Great, thanks, Jude. The The Well-Adapted UK report is going to be published alongside the rest of the CCRA4 Independent Assessment, which is in Q2 2026. So still a little bit of a way away. In terms of timeline for its development, there's a kind of a series of different evidence projects which are going to be kind of form the evidence base for the report, and some of those are kind of already kicking off now. I'm happy to answer any more kind of specific questions on that.
Thank you, Flo. The other question is from Felix. David, I'm not sure whether or not you've had a chance to look at this one. The question is, good to hear innovations in risk management. Will our new report, will our work include the findings from the new report or from the Accelerator for Systemic Risk Assessment, warning governments and businesses they need new approaches to tackle climate and geopolitical risk? Are you able to address that one, David?
Yeah, sure. So, Felix, so I'm actually, I'll be honest with you, I'm not aware of that report at all whatsoever. So thanks for raising that, because it looks really interesting. So the way that any new report can be incorporated into CCRA4 is obviously through the evidence, if it provides evidence of either risk, adaptation, or opportunities within the current or future time periods that we're looking at. And so that's one way it'd be incorporated, or it could help with us developing the methodology. So it's kind of, I'm not answering your question, but it's certainly something we'll look into. If it does contain evidence, then it will definitely be picked up within the chapters. And there will be, as Jason said, we're looking at how the risks interact between chapters as well. So it sounds like something that could potentially help inform with that. If you have some ideas or potential suggestions, please do get in touch. We would love to hear from you. Jason.
I was just going to add, because I've come across this group. One of my long-term collaborators has gone to work for them, actually. And I think one thing that comes across from that group more generally, but also is in their new report, so they put one out very recently, is the idea of taking a really clear systemic view of risk, recognizing all of the different stakeholders in that systemic risk, including the role of finance and including the role of specialists, but also citizens. I think there's some really good lessons around systemic risk that we can take into our risk assessment. I would hope we're going to pick up on material from that group, and in particular the academic literature behind the report, rather than just the report, because the quality assurance is really important to us.
Thank you, David and Jason, for responding to that question. I can see actually, Felix, I think you've provided us with the URL to that, so thank you very much for doing that. Another question from Kay. Maybe Rachel, you could pick this one up. What can we expect to hear about the sector-specific workshops, technical surveys? Do I need to opt in for these?
Yeah, no, brilliant. Thanks very much for your question. It's slightly different depending on the different chapters. So the chapter leads are taking their own approach to how they're dealing with this. So, for example, for the infrastructure chapter, they have just released their technical survey. They're advertising it really widely on LinkedIn and various platforms across their network. If you feel like there's a specific chapter that you wanted to contribute to with regards to these surveys and workshops, I'd advise emailing that central email so that we can link you up with chapter leads for that case. Because there's slightly different methodologies being applied across the different chapters in this case. So hopefully that answers your question. But yeah, do keep an eye out on LinkedIn and emails and various different forums, because that's where these things will be advertised.
Thank you, Rachel. One for you, David, regarding the risks themselves. Will wastewater be included in the water sector?
Oh, I was just typing a response. So yeah, thanks, Helen. That certainly was raised during our risk descriptor meetings early on with the chapter authors. So you're scratching my brain on the new risk descriptors, but it definitely included. I'm trying to remember whether it will fall within the infrastructure or the built environment chapter, but that was what the discussion was about. But rest assured, it's definitely was raised that previously it was more about water supply rather than dealing with wastewater.
Thanks, David. And Catherine's made a request for us to be clear about the differences between impacts, hazards and risks. David, whilst you're on, there's a question about the proposed logical hierarchy. Are you able to address that too?
David, I think you might be on mute.
Sorry, I'm just trying to find the question. So the question was about definitions of impacts, hazards and risks.
Yes, so a request that we're clear regarding the differences between impacts, hazards and risks. And
yes. So
the question,
again, this is something that's been raised from chapter authors as well about how we deal with this, and developing the glossary is the initial way of us developing our definitions of those and making those clear. Another additional term that needs to be clarified is our use of, well, a sort of link to that, I suppose, is the word cascading and interdependencies, which we've seen have been used in different forms during the past, and we understand that it's not very helpful for people who are trying to work with these things if the definitions aren't clear. So as Jason said, this process is very much co-developed, and we are taking the end user is always on our minds when we're developing the methodology, and so too the terminology. We've been pulled up on it on our guidance as well, because we've used terms somewhat flippantly throughout and mixed up, particularly around system risks. So yeah, they will be clearer from the glossary, and the quality assurance team will be informed to again review that and make sure that that's taken into the final report.
Thanks, David. I can see a question there from Andres, hope I pronounced it correctly, about the collection of evidence. So the call for evidence, we're towards the end of the first call. If you're able to share anything as part of that call, that's great. I see there you say it might not be publicly available, then just make us aware of that. But if you're able to share that as an organisation with us, that'd be really helpful. At the same time, following conclusion of this call, we will be issuing subsequent calls, possibly somewhat more tailored or more focused, but we're always interested to hear from you if you do have information that you feel relevant. So there's a website that I think Rachel's already put in the chat, actually, that highlights where you can submit evidence into that call for evidence, or it can go in via the email address that we've already shared today. It's very keen to get your input, whether or not that be traditional academic literature, stuff that's in the public domain, or grey literature. And so I can see there's a question from Kay. Jason, would you be able to take that one about the urgency scorings?
I'm actually wondering if David might want to pick up because it's in the methods chapter. So David, I'm going to give you first crack, but I'm happy to also have a go.
Sorry, I was just reading going back through the messages again. Yeah, it was actually that message I was going through, Catherine. So thanks for the reason I asked about the terminology is that risk equals impact like that. So it's weird seeing a proposed logical progression being hazard, risk, impact, risk owners. Yeah, I'll pass that to you, Jason. I'm struggling to.
David, it's a question below that, Kay's question on the urgency scoring. I thought just because that sits in the method chapter, you want. I'll come back
to the Q&A process here. So
that's okay. I'll pick up Catherine's next, if that's okay.
Right. Something more action. Yeah. So the urgency scoring is the final step of the essentially the CCRA3 process, and it's built from part of that is a magnitude score that the chapter authors are currently doing, which allows them to look at the evidence and develop an understanding of magnitude of that risk, particularly, and categorize that. And then once we've assessed the magnitude, we can then put that into the urgency scoring framework, which we are developing at the moment. So it will follow a process of almost identical to CCRA3, but with the addition of a further urgent investigation needed. So yeah, that it's what you've written down is what it should look like. But as I've said, we are reviewing the process at the moment. So if you do have particular comments on that, we'd welcome to hear them.
Thanks, David. I'll just come back briefly on Catherine's point. So firstly, I recognise your framing of risk as likelihood times impact or severity or consequence. I guess many of the authors certainly from a science background have the IPCC definition in mind, thinking in terms of hazard, vulnerability, and exposure, and being really clear on that distinction between hazard, vulnerability, and exposure is incredibly important. I think it's worthwhile actually splitting up the impact consequence term into exposure and vulnerability. The point of the logic model, that idea of hazard, risk, impact, risk owners, that was something that came out of the engagement around CCRA3. And I think the point is that the users were actually asking for clarity. So I think you're making the same point, I believe, but do come and tell me if I've got this wrong. That how we frame risk and what the driver of risk is incredibly important, and to do this right involves making sure we're all working to the same definition of these. We will try to be clear on that. Now, where it's relevant, we will also try to illustrate this schematically or diagrammatically, as other users have asked for. If we are doing it wrong within the report, do please tell us. And when we put it out in an interim form, if it's not clear, we really want to hear that. We hope by then we will have picked up any areas that are not clear or where the definition is ambiguous through the science assurance panel and the independent review. But you can never have too much checking. So thank you, but please keep us honest on this.
Thank you, Jason. Chris Dent, you have your hand raised and you've made a really useful comment in the chat. I'm afraid that I think you have I don't think you have presenter privileges, which means I don't think you can come off mute. We can. Okay, I beg your pardon. We're going to give you the ability to jump in. So Chris is part of the consortium, and we're just trying to figure out on Teams how to grant you access. I think that should be you, Chris. Can you try now?
A loud mic now, so he should be able to unmute himself.
Can you unmute yourself and join in, Chris?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you.
I'm honoured to have this. Oh, it looks like I can do camera as well. Yeah, I'm honoured to have this upgrading. But I'm one of the science assurance group under Jason, and I just made the point in the chat, and I think it's worth emphasising that the it's sometimes stated that risk is equal to impact times likelihood, and I think it's better to state that as the combination of impact and likelihood, because the multiplication there is strictly correct if you're working, say, in a Bayesian decision analysis framework where you carefully constructed an appropriate utility function. But it's if one isn't careful, it's possible for people to end up working in a picture of expected values where that's not appropriate, particularly when you're dealing with rare severe events. So I think it's best simply to state it's best simply to state this as the combination of impacts and likelihood, and then think appropriately in context about how these need to be combined.
Thanks, Chris. I guess we also, factoring into our discussion, is the practical challenge that sometimes likelihood is difficult to define for some particular hazards, and factoring that in, the fact that we're dealing with deep uncertainty is something we need to also do.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I mean, very often this is. Very often the first step in these things is simply before one starts looking at any kind of high technology in risk analysis, is simply recognizing what the situation is, recognizing what we do and what we don't know, because very often the situation when one talks about deep uncertainty, very often the situation is what I might refer to as tentative knowledge rather than no knowledge, and then that gives you the very often also then bringing, rather than simply looking at risk assessment somewhat in the abstract, it's very often bringing it together with what the possible decisions are that gives you a focus for working through these difficult uncertainty situations which characterize a lot of questions in climate.
Thanks, Chris. I'm just going to, very brief, if I may, just pull it back to Catherine's original point, and just say again that the team producing this, we can talk about risk a lot, but ultimately we do need the feedback. We do need this to be understandable by as big a group as possible. So we very much encourage the scrutiny when this goes out to wider review to make sure we're achieving that level of clarity.
Thank you, Jason. We've only got a few minutes left, so I'll just try to take a couple more questions. Roger, would you be kind enough to pop your question or comment in the chat if that's okay? So got questions, one question around how risks like flooding or coastal erosion are important for all sectors, and how are we going to deal with that? I think that's something we've been thinking about a little, and our approach is to make sure that it is referenced across the chapters that it is relevant for. So it may well be that we have to do a bit of signposting across chapters, but we're going to make sure that they are considered as part of that. Jason, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, and I mean, this is one of the areas where we've tried to make it simpler to read, and that is in the risk descriptors, where it's possible, taking a view of framing it in terms of the receptor and acknowledging there will be a range of hazards that can affect a particular receptor. In terms of flooding and coastal erosion, yes, of course, it impacts many different types of receptors. One of the exciting things that's going on at the moment is a mapping between the narrative in the State of the Climate chapter and the different, if you like, that different mapping of hazard onto receptor in the component system chapters. So I hope the end result is a simpler read, but this is very much at the heart of the way we've treated the methods to make sure we don't miss any of these hazard onto receptor links.
Thank you, Jason. One from Helen. Maybe David, you could pick this one up. Can you explain more around how certain risks versus less certain risks will be dealt with?
So is that in the question?
Yeah, it's near the top. It's
new post. There we go. Helen, right? Okay. Sorry, I thought I was reading the latest one. Can I explain around how certain risks versus less certain risks will be dealt with? I'm thinking here around sea level rise, which we know will happen regardless of 2050 targets being met. Yeah, sorry, I'm a bit struggling to understand what you mean by dealt with. If you'd mean dealt with in terms of the methodology, in terms of certainty, so the authors are asked to review and make judgments on the quality of the evidence that they've got and the certainty of that evidence, and that's part of the methodology. So again, that forms part of the final urgency scoring. So if, for instance, we know that sea level rise is going to cause widespread impacts, but if we didn't have much certainty on the actual magnitude of, or the risks of the, my terminology now, our exposure to that hazard, then that will be dealt with within the urgency scoring method, in terms of how much evidence, how confident are we? So there is a confidence rating within the methodology that the authors are use their expert judgment to deal with. So yeah, we assess confidence in the evidence, and we also have this now urgent further investigation needed if we feel like we need more evidence in there, which will hopefully influence, research going forward.
Thanks, David. So there's a question from Zoe about clearer version of the outcomes and progress table. I think, Rachel, you're suggesting we could add that to the website.
Yeah, I think we can probably just PDF the diagram that you're referring to and just add it as a link onto the website so that everyone's got access to it.
Thanks, Rachel. That's a good shout, Zoe. And finally, Jude, maybe we started with a question for Flo about the well-adapted UK report. Maybe, Flo, you could pick up this last one from Jude.
Yeah, I think it's a valid point. I suppose, as I set out in kind of our presentation, that the fourth climate change risk assessment, the primary purpose is to inform the fourth national adaptation plan. So we are really focusing on what action is urgent and we think that needs to be taken in the short term. And yeah, definitely by the end of the fourth national adaptation plan, I doubt we get to this wonderful, well-adapted UK state. So yeah, I think it's a valid point. Could take it away. When I focus on specific conditions present in cities, yeah, so all of our analysis we're conducting at a sort of spatially disaggregated level and considering how, yeah, different sort of factors in the exposure might mean that risks play out differently. So we will be considering sort of city level impacts within our analysis.
Thank you, Flo. Thank you also to my other co-presenters and those of you who answered the questions this afternoon. Thank you for everybody's engagement. It's been really great to see so many questions in the chat. If you have any subsequent thoughts, ideas, questions, please do reach out either to chapter leads or through the generic email address that was up earlier, because we're really keen to hear from you in due course. So just remains for me to say enjoy the rest of your day and thank you for your engagement.